The topic for the first one is, like I said, the intersection of clinical, financial, and operational excellence. I do want to, just invite and introduce our panelists that I'd love to welcome on stage. I'd first like to, just invite Akshay Oleti from Fortis. He's the Vice President and Business Head for the Karnataka region, runs 5 hospitals. And Akshay, thank you so much for doing this. Feel free to grab a seat. There is the next one on the, and I think Akshay is a non-clinician on the panel. Right? We were just speaking outside. We've got a lot of common overlaps. Software engineering and consulting and this and that and ops and MBAs and all. So hopefully we'll engage on many more topics. The next one I'd like to invite is Dr. Sudarshan Rawat. Dr. Rawat, esteemed customer, very famous personality. I think a lot of us know. One thing I love about Dr. Rawat is just the humility that I get to see every time I meet with him. Dr. Rawat is the head of department of radiology at Manipal hospitals, and thank you so much for coming this evening, sir. Next up, I'd like to invite Dr. Vishal Rao. Dr. Vishal Rao is senior director of oncology, the chair of oncology at HCG hospitals. Again, I think I speak on behalf of this panel and actually on behalf of everyone at Augnito. Everybody that's so far here, and also the next 2 chairs that we fill. Humility is something that is so understated these days, and despite the fact that there's so much that each one of us on this panel have accomplished, we really appreciate all the love and affection that we get from all of you. Thank you so much, sir, this evening. The next up, Dr. Manish, Mattoo. Dr. Manish is the CEO for the Karnataka region for Apollo hospitals. Great to see you. I'm going to keep my hands to myself. Okay, public announcement. I haven't shaken anyone's hand this evening, so you're not the only one. The only reason is a little bit of an emergent situation.
I feel less hurt.
Yeah, among several, accomplishments from Dr. Manish Mattoo. What is it mute here? Dr. Manish speaks very well, by the way.
Piyush, that mute was there for every other photograph, so it's the photo asked actually.
Oh, okay. Thank you for calling that out. There's something that does not go right in everything that we do. But Dr. Manish and I are also, alums from the same business school, so we've got a lot, in common outside of the work that he does. And last up, but definitely not the least, is Dr. Uthappa, the group medical director at Narayana. It's our pleasure to have this entire panel with us, and hopefully, in the next, we'll try and keep it focused in about 45 to 50 minutes, not too long. If I do have your permission, I may request you to cut short some conversations, just to be the humble timekeeper that I will be. All right. Okay. So with that, I just wanted to quickly talk about the theme once again, setting the stage. It's obviously the intersection of clinical, financial, and operational excellence. We've got a clinician leadership here. We've got a business leadership. Being a clinician, we've got clinicians, and business leaders. So I think there's going to be a few things that we'll cover, but I think the first question I really want to open up, and anyone can choose to answer, is when you talk about measuring any initiative that leads to some sort of excellence across these 3 paradigms, what are some of the strategies, ideas, thoughts that really open up with? How do you measure, let's say, clinical excellence for you?
Thank you, Piyush. Thank you for inviting me. Actually, I'm here to learn more from my esteemed colleagues and analysts here. Clinical excellence is, it means different to different people. And if you look at it from patient's perspective, they mainly look at the clinical outcome. For example, let's say if you come and have a knee operation or knee replacement, what they're interested is how soon they're going to get out of the hospital, how successful the operation will be, whether they'll have any complications, and what will the quality of life after that, can they walk, and so many other things. But to achieve this from the hospital point of view, from the doctor's point of view, there are a lot of things that happen when they're in the hospital. So there's a lot of processes and systems, clinical guidelines and pathways. So to have pathways for this particular operation, you need evidence-based medicine, you need the entire pathway going in a certain manner. And there's also a safety element to it. Hospitals are dangerous places. You can come to harm very easily if you don't have systems in place. Okay, it is dangerous. And most of the time, apart from treating, we're trying to avoid harm. So, do you have systems in place to, so that patients don't get any healthcare associated infections or ulcers or VTEs or so many other things. So these things are also measured. So if you achieve no healthcare associated infection, no falls, no harm to the patient, that's also clinical excellence apart from the treatment. So there's one from the patient side, one from the hospital and doctor side.
Excellent. I mean, it's well put. I think the one thing I picked up out of this, which is a little bit of a recap into my other life, is avoid harm. And the aviation sector, all of us, are on flights every day. We get met with flight crews, etc. But what you get to experience every day on one flight that you take is literally, I forget the quote, it was between 20 to 30% of their training. There's 70 or probably 90% of their training, which is to say, what do you do in case of emergencies? And God willing, none of us will ever have to see that part of life, but just preparing for no harm is so critical.
Yeah, the best healthcare system in the world have taken all the learnings from the aviation industry.
Okay.
If you want to have a hospital with zero harm, or your patient should not come to any avoidable harm, it's very important to know avoidable harm. So you come into the hospital, it's very likely you can fall. So what are the steps you have put in place to stop that fall happening? So all the checklists, it's full of checklists. Right from the point they come in to the point they go to the hospital, the entire journey is full of checklists. So that's what we learn that from the aviation industry.
Oh, I just turned to sound intelligent here, but thank you. But I think I'm gonna dovetail to Dr. Manish. If you want to close out a comment or talk about.
Yeah, just quickly want to add to it. I think clinical excellence, if I look at it, is the intangible aspect, the immeasurables, which for example, the quality of pedigree of doctors, the breadth and depth of clinical programs, the subspecialties and super specialties that any hospital has, the publications, what kind of research is happening in a hospital. So those are the immeasurable elements. The other aspect is the tangible, the measurable aspects, which I think many hospitals have these days now. And right from my previous organization to the current ones, there are various parameters. To name a few, I would say, the mortality rate, average length of stay, central line associated bloodstream infection, catheter associated urinary tract infection, survival rate, after 1 year of transplants, for example, VTE, as Dr. Uthappa said, ventilator required pneumonia, ulcers, readmission rate, for example, 5-year survival rate, return to OT, return to ICU. There are several, and the list can go on. So I would say every organization has these elements these days, especially the accredited organizations. But I think it's important to make a distinction between measurable and measurable elements, and there are many out there. But I want to end by saying that it's not just how we measure excellence, it's how these elements and these parameters are measured at the ground level. And there's a lot of subjectivity, so we have to make sure that we are accurate in our assessment of our clinical excellence or scorecards. And a lot of it is manual these days. And it will be great if we can automate that too. And companies like Augnito or other organizations which are doing a lot of work in automation can help us do that.
Well, great thoughts. And don't put the mic down yet. I think I'm going to throw another parameter back at you. You spoke about clinical excellence. What about financial and operational excellence? Because as a CEO, you're responsible for running the hospitals. So thoughts on that?
Well, financial and ops excellence, I think there's so much work that's happened, and healthcare has learned. Financial excellence parameters are very common, right from gross revenue to EBITDA to gross contribution to PAT and average revenue per occupied bed, average cost per occupied bed, EBITDA per bed. The list is endless. But I think largely the focus has been for organizations like Apollo has been that how do we measure accurately the clinical excellence, the nursing excellence, then the ops excellence and financial excellence in that order. But for ops excellence too, and many parameters, and like my previous organization did a lot of work on ops excellence. My current organization, we have done that. I mean, just to answer that question specifically, I would bucket ops excellence into 3 different parameters. One is outpatient, and then you have outpatient waiting time for appointments, for diagnostics, CT, ultrasound, and many organizations have these parameters these days. Phlebotomy time, for example, right up to that. And then you have inpatient, you have admission time, discharge time, the throughput, the turnaround time for many parameters. Essentially, I would say ops excellence measures fundamentally the waiting time of patients at each checkpoint or each touch point. So that's how organizations, most healthcare organizations, measure ops excellence.
But I mean, it's commendable because Dr. Uthappa and I were just having a chat while we were standing outside, and we were reminiscing about our time, our corresponding times in the UK. And there was at a national level in the UK with the NHS, it drives a lot of processes around figuring out how clinicians across the country, across trusts, etc., are doing on a particular procedure. And there was one particular thing I still remember. It was reference casting, whatever the name was. But overall, the idea was for every hip replacement surgery that is done across the NHS, what is the amount of time it's taken for each surgery? There's data available. And then there's an average and a median, and an intended average and median. And then, there are certain doctors or sites or hospitals that would go massively over, massively under. The ones that went under were, obviously measured with readmission rates and, survival rates, etc. as well. So it's very complex. It's complex. But thanks for your opening comments there. Dr. Vishal, I'm going to ask you, a question on, we've sort of covered on what are parameters to measure, clinical, financial, operational excellence. But, in your experience, when you talk about all the work that you've done within oncology, for instance, what are some of the important metrics that are very critical? Because obviously that's a very specialized science.
So coming back to where we spoke about clinical excellence, it I think is a direct reflection of outcomes. In some way, we put together all of these complex parameters, it's outcomes. And you look at it in 3 perspectives: a patient's perspective, a hospital's perspective, and a doctor's perspective. Now all 3 have different views to excellence.
Yeah.
So when I claim as a doctor that we have a center of excellence versus a hospital looking at it versus a patient experiencing it, I think are 3 different perspectives that we get into. I can take one example from our recent experiences in robotic surgeries and how we've evolved from 6-7 years back saying robots have no use to now saying that all the things that I taught as an examiner, telling my junior students that this is the way you should approach it, we have reversed it, and we have now said science has changed. And the most interesting learning in this metrics is that metrics itself is changing. I don't know, for some strange reason, and that's where I saw robotics evolving. The metrics that we conventionally used for conventional procedures versus robotics today or some new modalities. A very interesting trend that came out, it was a very nice editorial that came in one of the journals that said that in medical fraternity, every time that you cross a level of training, let's say medical school, then after that post-graduation, then super specialty, your proficiency improves towards mastery. But every time you introduce a new technology, your proficiency reduces. So outcomes reduces. So there is a complex play between the two, and which is why clinicians are more, they're less amicable to change, because that reduces the thing. But recently what I saw with the robotics was, they showed the same graph with the metrics improving, which is not like the time graph of your proficiency was much lesser. So if it was months in laser, it would have been days in robotics. The last surprise that I got recently when I was in US at Sunnyvale talking to them was, we were doing training saying that robotics, animal training, you get certain proficiency. Then you go into human cadaver, you get proficiency. Then you go to proctorship, wherein you stand behind the trained surgeon, you get something. Then you finally do your procedure. So you have said this time, no, we've changed the whole thing now with FDA and the support. We directly go from simulation to humans directly.
Wow.
Now that's a leap, correct, in a metric. So they have their own. So I think the point I'm trying to allude to is, I think metrics itself is such an evolving field today, and regulatory versus accreditation bodies versus clinicians, administrators are all evolving day to day based on metrics. But finally boils down to patient outcome somewhere, which is the most pertinent common denominator in all of these metrics, while some of these metrics keep changing.
Yeah, no, I mean, these are obviously, very futuristic thoughts, so thanks for sharing. I think the one question I have back for you, when you mentioned, as an examiner, while you're, teaching, students, as science has changed, what you're teaching students is also changing. From our experience, we've also realized that, the timeline to advocacy, which is sort of an internal metric for us to say, first use, adoption, advocacy and all. We realize that the younger crop of doctors are much quicker to embrace technology and start generating results and value beyond that, right? Is that consistent? I'm only speaking on behalf of Augnito, for instance. You're obviously covering 1,000 things. Is that a trend that is pervasive, or are there variations?
I am seeing this trend, obviously. I can relate to about a month back in the G20 summit in Delhi. There was a session called Disrupt where we were asked to speak. And it was opened by the Ministry of External Affairs. Followed by that, they told us that we will be speaking age-wise, and we didn't understand why. So first was a 9-year-old boy who spoke, who talked about developing 2 apps, written 3 books. Then was a 16-year-old person who runs a 100 crore company. Then was a 24-year-old YouTuber millionaire who was talking. So I realized that every single space, healthcare is slow in adapting. So the interesting part is industry is at 4.0, web is at 3.0, and health is at 2.0, grappling.
Yes.
So we are slow.
Yes.
But we're catching up. But I don't think we are at that leap of the best of the cutting edge of. But the youth are definitely much more adaptive and more open to technology, which I think is unavoidable today. We'll have to somewhere embrace it, draw the line, and see where do we draw that fine line between efficiency versus overuse.
Yeah. No, I mean, great summarization there. But I think a lot of gratitude also goes to leaders like yourself, who are willing to A, understand that tech is important, B, understand what it will do to your life, C, embrace it, D, champion it, and then further train your teams.
Just for the YouTuber asked us a question in the open forum. He said, how many of you all use social media? So in an audience like this, everybody raised their hands. हम लोग use करते हैं. So he said, tell us the names. So we said the usual names, 6 names. He said Gen Z, Gen Alpha don't use these. So then we started searching which are the ones. But the point was, it's a very rapidly evolving thing. We didn't know these apps. Whatever he spoke about, I was not aware. So he gave a very nice example of Insta. He said they don't use Insta. They use an app called Be Real, wherein they show the real self, not the makeup, cool stuff, smiley, extra thing, which is not the real one.
Wow.
So, I'm saying things are changing in the youth and in the next generation. It's going to be much faster in terms of adaptation for new technology.
No, thanks so much. And I think, yes, there'll be a generational change that will help, shorten the time for adoption. But, we're going to present a few things that will, help you understand, and all of us understand that adoption can actually be reduced even in the current, day and age with all sorts of generational users that we work with. Dr. Rawat, you're obviously leading a very important chapter at Manipal. When you talk about excellence, and I know, from our experience and conversations, you cut across everything. What is, I should not say the most important metric, but what are some of the top 3, top 5 metrics that are important when you talk about excellence?
So let's put in clinical sides, as they spoke. They run management part and they are very experienced and they know other part of the management much better than me. As a clinician, I would say if I have to talk in terms of excellence on the clinical part, I would say what I need, a doctor should have confidence, good communication skills, right diagnosis of treatment, and the least possible complication. This I would talk about clinical excellence in brief. And this applies to whether we are talking about clinicians or talking about my Radiology, applies to all of them. Then as you spoke about, so technology part is, see, future is gonna be healthcare plus technology combination. It's a very good future, right? With further assistance by AI. Similarly, if you call a young guy or somebody youth, right? If you call a phone, they will not pick up the phone. You send them WhatsApp, you get immediate reply.
Yeah.
Right? So it
You
works
get
like that.
judged.
Yeah.
But in the middle of all of this, there's obviously certain frameworks around which you will measure excellence and all. But like you said, there's technology that will drive healthcare forward. And let's say there's a new tech that comes in, right? I'm gonna maybe dovetail that question to you as well. From your experience as a clinician, whenever you're presented with a new technology, how do you analyze, evaluate, assess it on whether it's clinically relevant, it's going to be useful and important for you? What's your decision-making process?
So when any new technology coming, let's say Augnito or similar platform like you, okay, they may not show you direct return on investment, but indirectly they're invaluable for the system because they're helping a lot to doctors in the system, right? So there's no direct ROI, but there's a significant indirect ROI, right? So if suppose in radiology or maybe in pathology, you might be using other voice digitation software or maybe typist, you have a limit, you can't go beyond certain limit. But here we're given such good options, in the software, where we can be much faster. And sometimes you don't have to see the page, but we're speaking actually. That's a very important thing. Otherwise, most of the time, radiologists used to spend a lot of time on the typing it rather than seeing the image. Ideally, should be other way, right? So it makes a difference. So this is one part. Second part, AI is a part of healthcare. It's gonna be. There's no way we can prevent it. It's gonna come. It's coming, and there are so many platforms and there are so many startups involved. It's crowded place, right? Some of them are very good, and you have to be open to adopt to them. Let's talk about radiology. There are some very good startups. They will make us more efficient. They will make us more error-free. So what I am doing today is let's say 20 or 30 cases reporting. It will go up to 50, 60, 70, maybe 150 also without making any mistake. So we should be open to adopt them.
Yeah. The last comment is so important and crucial because I remember about maybe 3 to 5 years ago, there was this whole AI surge of new tech that was coming in that said, we are going to do automatic report generation and this and that, etc., etc. And all radiologists, especially, this was one very specific conversation in an imaging conference that I was part of, and they say there was this one camp of radiologists that said there is no tech that can do it better than our eyes. There was this other camp which is exactly what you mentioned. If this can help me make the final decision on 20 instead of 2, it is assistive and not competitive.
Yes, absolutely. I should be open to it.
Yeah. One final question, and this is open, it's a yes or no thing. Do you still find clinicians of the former kind who are saying, I am better than technology in today's day and age? Just a yes or no.
You have to ask your parents what the answer.
Clinicians hate Google for sure.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. Actually, shifting over to you, as a non-clinician on the panel, you're the only non-clinician on the panel along with me. But I get to ask the questions. Across your checkered career, with Narayana Health and Rainbow, now with Fortis, can you talk about an initiative that you picked up, that you implemented, that was actually able to deliver some of these outcomes?
Absolutely, yes. And when we look at technology, we look at what can create a path of least resistance for us. On a day-to-day basis, one thing we keep saying is we don't need leaders and managers if there are no problems, right? So if the assembly line is working perfectly every day, why do we need a manager? Why do we need a leader to come in? But thankfully, healthcare has so many, it's a proper jungle and there are so many issues that can happen in the day-to-day operations that all the leaders are always busy. And where we look at technology, how it can help us is if it can standardize, let us say we have specialized something, we have done the best way of doing certain things, and technology can help us replicate that. We have 5 hospitals in Bangalore. all the 5 hospitals do knee replacements, and all of them do it completely different ways. We spoke about clinical pathways. Yes, we would like to document a clinical pathway, but then how each clinician interprets it, how each technician is trained, and all those things will vary. One specific technology we looked at implementing was, and we implemented also, is the patient monitoring system post ICU stay. So we worked with an organization which provided us these Internet of Things wearable devices on the patient, which would monitor the patient status right after an ICU stay, and the highest chances of code blue, which is a heart attack in layman terms, happens right after the patient comes out of ICU. And this is a place where the care is much less intensive, so it's not an intensive care unit. And technology helped in reducing so many code blues that occurred in the hospital. And when we look at the overall scheme of things, it looks like, yes, clinical excellence is there, but that is not enough. We need to look at how the whole system will work along with the way, the scheme of things the hospital has, so that comprehensively, clinically, operationally, as well as financially, everything makes sense. And we are very happy to see that this got implemented successfully, and all stakeholders, nurses, the doctors, the management, everyone was happy with the way the product was implemented and how it started giving results. And that is a good explanation of understanding where the gap is and fixing that.
Right.
The biggest challenge in healthcare is adaptability. Many of us have touched about it. So there is a lot of responsibility on tech providers also to make it as simple as possible. We say senior doctors don't use software, and we do have doctors who still are pen and paper based, and they don't want, and they're worried about a computer coming on their desk. But we know all of them have at least 100 apps in their mobile phone, so they are tech savvy. But there is a lot of onus on the tech providers to make sure that adaptability is increased, and if that happens, then it is much easier.
Yeah, I mean, sort that last thing, sort of evoked a thought in my head. There's, one of my, very close sort of friends, mentors in the larger thing. He's a very senior and, one of the top 5 cardiovascular surgeons in New York. And he and I were over, at a dinner on Thursday night, and he's like, Piyush, I really wanted to meet you, but you know what? After we get done in the next 2-3 hours, I have 81 cases to finish off for patients that I met as like Tuesday or something. So it's just the amount of duress and stress that all the clinicians are. It's like they're coping with saving lives. While they're in the middle of doing a report, suddenly get called because there's a code blue, for instance, or I don't know what the codes are when it's in surgery. It's like there's so much going on with clinicians that there was one of the part that you mentioned about make it simple for tech providers, and one of the very fundamental things that we actually stand for, that Rustam actually evangelizes a lot on, is the human-centered design aspect. Because unless and until you get inside the skin and the shoes of the end user, which is doctors, really understand what do they do when they wake up at 6 o'clock or get woken up at 5 o'clock or are not allowed to go to bed because there's a critical emergency in hospitals. From that point on, they've got spouses, they've got children, they've got parents, they've got families. All of that comes secondary. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Which sort of leads me as a little bit of a segue now, maybe into a last round of dialogue there. When you talk about Dr. Uthappa, a lot of things that you're driving at NH on the process side. How do processes contribute towards driving a lot of these initiatives and excellence? And maybe if you're allowed to speak about your recent accomplishments on the accreditations.
I'll just continue with what
Sure.
my colleagues said there. Just give one example. This is a real example. One of almost all our hospitals are high volume centers. One particular hospital was doing very complex surgeries, and the patient stayed in what we call as ALOS, average length of stay was 17 to 18 days. So we introduced the clinical pathways, with the help of the clinicians, and there are a lot of resistance because there's quite at least 10 different clinicians doing the same thing in 10 different ways. But somehow we managed to get them all together and introduce the clinical pathways. And you won't believe our A loss has come down from 18 to 10. My aim is to bring it down to 7.
Wow.
Okay, that's one of the simplest thing you can do. That is one of the processes. Very complex, I can't tell you. I'll tell you later on. Okay, so going back to your question, we at Narayana Health, we are going through a transformational change now. So one of the things we want to do, want to be is the safest organized healthcare provider in the country, where our aim is to have zero harm, where no patient comes to any avoidable harm. So we embarked on something called clinical governance, because as I mentioned earlier on, what we all struggle to do, or what we all end up doing as clinicians when the patient comes to the hospital is trying to make sure that they don't come to any harm. So a lot of things can bring in harm, right from your identifying patients to having concentrated electrolytes to handovers. If you don't do the proper handovers, if you don't do proper safety checks before the patient is shifted to the ward, shifted to the OT, if you don't have systems in place to make sure the patient won't fall, and other things will be simple things like maintaining medical records, making sure that you have a proper, robust health care, infection control policies. So a lot of things are there, not only to provide clinical excellence, but also make sure the patient won't come to harm. So how do you get all these things done? So we created a framework within which all the clinicians and the stakeholders, nurses, doctors, everybody work. We involve all the doctors, the nurses, from the pharmacists to the dietitians. We provide them the metrics on a monthly basis. It's kind of calendarized, like a first week, second week, third week, and the department leads look into the department matrices, which covers all the things I mentioned and many more. And it's all templated. We have digitized the whole thing, so there's no paper or anything, so it makes life easy for them. Then that's reported to the department lead, which in turn reports to the hospital lead, who in turn reports to me. So I kind of have an oversight of the entire groups on a monthly basis. So what has that done is streamlined the entire process. Now we kind of have standardization of policies, standardization of procedures, clinical guidelines, pathways. We introduced some 15 pathways and 15 different specialties. So that can be shown in our matrix. It shows that we are inching towards getting safer. That is also shown in terms of operational efficiency and definitely in financial gains and everything. So and this is the 18th month of what we are doing, and it's been quite challenging initially. Doctors are not great at embracing change, but they'll embrace change when it comes to their procedures and treatment and training and whatnot, because they've gone upskill and reskill. But anything else, they just want to not do it till a point comes where you're forced to do it. So that's been quite challenging for us, but because the consistency is very important. You do that on a regular basis. You just can't provide on SOP or a guideline and say do it. No, it's not going to work. So consistency, what's happened is.
Yeah. Just as a little bit of a follow-on thought on that. You sort of mentioned doctors don't embrace change that well. The second thing that you mentioned was they lost down from 18 to 10. I think one of the things, our theme is beyond EMR adoption. If I take off the beyond word and only focus on EMR adoption, one of the big challenges that leaders like yourselves, that come to us and tell us is, we are struggling in deploying an EMR because doctors are coming back and saying, look at this, I have to click 17 times to do this versus me just scribbling on paper, right? And I see people nodding here. Is that a common thing that you guys hear as well? And there was a very classic case. I won't name which hospital, which city, but I was sitting with the CEO and the CIO, and they said, what? And the CEO was very proudly, mentioning, what? We're running this initiative that's bringing down 18 clicks down to 10, and we're changing an EMR. We're changing this part in this. We're upgrading that, blah 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 blah. And I'm sitting there. I like being provocative. And I'm sitting there, I said, is it 10 clicks, 9 clicks too many? What if the doctor could just do it with 1 click? Right? And it's one of those fundamentals always is to ask, why not this? Versus, what do we do to go from here to here, which is still maybe too much?
I will answer that question. We are going through that challenge, and I'm particularly going through the pain of introducing EMR.
Okay.
We have around 22 large hospitals, and yesterday was the last hospital where we introduced the EMR as to mandated the whole thing. So Vijay is here. 92% of our hospitals, 92% of doctors are using it. It's a big achievement for us. We moved from 30% to 92%, and that didn't come in that easily. And I can officially tell you, on record, I'm the most hated person in the group now amongst the doctors. But it's almost impossible to bring that 17, 16, 10 clicks to 1 click. Because there are certain things where are mandatory fields you need to fill in. And why do you need to fill in? Because there are safety issues. For example, I can tell you there's an allergy section, or a medication section, or investigation section. You can bring it to 1 click there. It has to be clicked.
Sure.
Okay, but it's amazing how much difference that has made for us in terms of safety. Okay, thanks.
Well, we have a little bit of a reveal coming up in about an hour or so once Rustam comes back on. Like I say, I love being provocative. All of us love being provocative. We'll show you something. But Dr. Manish, I have one question. Once you implement an initiative and you're driving whatever outcomes, do you periodically review the efficacy of an initiative, and how do you defend the particular choice of system, tool, process to drive this initiative versus something else that might come externally?
My mantra is simple. Consider that the initiative will be partially executed unless you have a very focused execution team in place. I've seen so many times we have some grand ideas, but for lack of the right team, the right champion, and the right execution cadence to it, the ideas have failed. So unless, and I keep telling the team that you can safely assume that things are not working on the ground unless you're double checking yourself for a couple of weeks, couple of months, depending on the scale of the initiative. Only then should you assume that things are happening as they are supposed to on the ground. So I think it's important, one, to stay heavily execution focused, have the right team with the right objectives incorporated in their KRAs, and then have the right cadence to monitor the implementation. And of course, you can have multiple layers of oversight for that initiative, but I would say it's execution from the top. I mean, the leadership has to own the execution, set the right team in place, and have various levels of information coming to you from multiple sources. So just don't rely on one source of information to know whether the implementation is happening on the ground or not.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. My next question is to both of you, clinician leaders. Is there any pet project, favorite implementation or technology? Don't say Augnito. We know it is, but don't say Augnito. Outside of Augnito, which is your most favorite technology that you might have seen, embraced, adopted, or can't live without now?
I think my recent experiences was with robotic surgery.
Okay.
And that's the technology that I've adopted very strongly. I've also created our own metrics to look at how to compare with global standards. And the key trick in this, what I've understood, is it's gamified it. They've gamified it so much because of which I'm able to engage with it. Otherwise, we'll hit the same EMR behavioral issue. So the between the two fingers, between my index finger and thumb, there are 1,000 data points that keep engaging me to show me data of world surgeons in my console to tell me where I am compared with the US surgeon versus me. So a lot of things that I'm actually getting addicted to is it's giving me a little bit of competitive edge like a video game.
Wow.
I've got some competitors, I've got some data points, I've got some metrics that are telling me. I've got outcomes, and it's also auto-creating my results to tell me how I can go and project it outside. So it's kind of gamified in a way that I'm stuck to it, trying to say that I need to know more about this, which is unusual. Where I'm entering my own data with robotics with this, because I'm able to get so much of information from their side. It's the first time we've set up a steering committee with the Intuitive team to actually watch this more closely and understand how do we work better. Now this is correct, this is so unconventional that we are ourselves asking them, give us more information, we want to work more on this.
Right.
And I think they fooled us well in that, because I think it's gamified well. So you're actually running that game very, very silently without they asking you to say that you need to follow this. But we are giving them the data very nicely. And Intuitive now in I think 90 countries, they were telling me, have their presence in 90 countries, the robots. So between two fingers of thousands of surgeons, imagine the data they must be sitting with on each. Between the two fingers, they have 1,000 data points on which they are able to predict the actual performance of a surgeon. So that's something that I learned from all.
Thank you. Dr. Rawat?
And in EMR, I'll say one thing, you would like a doctor who will have more social interaction with you, eye contact rather than sitting on the computer. Okay, so less number of clicks better for the patient as well. You will definitely not like to see a doctor, you go walk in, he says hi and he's busy on the computer, because whatever you're saying he's doing on computer.
Yes.
Alright, so that's one part. Our team, Shivanand and all, they have done a lot of work on this. So they have reduced clicks significantly down, And where, second point, our favorite project now, of course, beyond Augnito is back implementation, which we are doing it. So they have actually enabled it where we click only one button and we get the all concise tree on one page. So that is second thing. And what you say is that efficacy, see generally when we buy stuff or any product, right? So we have gone through multiple checks, which you would know, right?
Sure.
Team 1, team 2, team 3 has checked you. One is purchase team, one is IT team, one is the department, whatever. So we actually have to look for support system. If support system is good, everything is fine.
Right. Well, thank you. Akshay, one last question to the panel. We were also closing out of time. If you had to pick one initiative that you've seen implemented that actually led to some great outcome, what was that great outcome across clinical, financial, or operational, and what was that implementation?
So, one very interesting implementation we did in my previous organization was the implementation of analytics. Coming back to the previous point where there is so much of information data coming in through various sources. Imagine if there is analytics sitting on top of it that gives you information on which you can immediately take decisions.
Right.
And this is not going to be restricted to financials, even on a clinical side. So there used to be a software, that algorithm which used to run on thousands of patients' consultation data on a day-to-day basis. Real time it would tell that this patient is a suitable candidate for liver transplant and send that information to the liver transplant surgeon along with the phone number of the patient, obviously within the system, so that way. So there used to be a lot of conversions within the system, and all that was required is a simple med score algorithm that was running on top of the data, and it created so much of value to the overall system. The number of liver transplants immediately started doubling actually.
Right.
And technology can be beautiful that way, right? And you don't have to do magic, because like we discussed before, we're still at Health 2.0. We have not even touched the tip of the iceberg, and there's so much that we can do, and it's just marvelous what we can achieve just by looking a little bit deeper into what is going on today.
No, thank you so much for those comments, and I think I really appreciate all of the experiences that you've been able to evoke. Before I thank the panel, there's just a couple of slides I wanted to talk about. Dr. Rawat, about 15-20 minutes ago, you made a comment that there may not be direct ROI. Thank you. I actually wanted to just dovetail into an implementation that we've done. This is for one of our large customers. Look at this. So essentially, until the slide comes up, essentially what we did was, this was a massive implementation. Hundreds of physicians. We sort of picked up a cohort of 350 physicians across multiple times in the year, just to remove biases around attribution around seasonality. February mein, let's say flu season hota hai, so pathological diagnostics zyada hoga, whatever. But across 27 specialties, across 40 odd sites, 100% of the doctors agreed that Augnito's made it easier to input clinical notes in their software. So that was one big achievement. 89.5% of those doctors agreed that Augnito helped them improve the quality of reports. And obviously, the minute the quality of report improves, let's say on an imaging use case, suddenly the referring physician has more accurate, data points to be able to, put the better clinical pathway for care protocols. 96.5% doctors agreed that they were able to send reports faster, to a point where when you talk about, a lot of the operational parameters that we mentioned, the turnaround time for, let's say, an MRI or a CT report was about 7 to 8 hours on an average. That dropped to 1 hour on an average. And in a very rare case when you had to, get multiple doctors looking at it, up to 2 hours. And the impact that these, turnaround time reduction initiatives drive for, let's say, hospitals and really big, flagship, hospitals in a city do for patients that are coming in from tier 3, tier 4 towns, daily wage earners, they're actually giving up the income for the family for one day to come do a test. If the report is only going to come 8 hours later, they probably have to come another day, and that's income loss. And suddenly all they had to do was just wait 1 hour, take the report, go back home, and they're not losing their income time. And that was sort of a little bit on the turnaround time there. And the other thing, if we can just roll, our net promoter score is 58. Somebody would say 58 out of 100 in the Indian academic system. Like 90% se kam bete ne kiya to kuch nahi kiya. 58 NPS is actually pretty decent. But I think the important thing is, we were able to figure out, we spoke about the documentation time before Augnito, 7 hours down to 1 hour. And therefore, on an average, you were saving about 5 hours every day. And we asked the doctors, what would you do with this time that you saved? And coming back to my earlier comment about, if they get woken up at 5 versus waking up at 6, going to bed at 1 or not being able to go to bed at 1. There was like an even split between doing more consultations, add to your work-life balance, get more time for clinical research. But I think there was a very strong component, especially from Bangalore, where they said, I'd love to spend more time with the patient. And something that, we were talking about, my patient is sitting here, but I'm, looking at the computer, and, a lot of those things are actually getting, improved and impacted as well. And I think, eventually, just as a summarization, it's, using our technology, it was enabled data entry into EMR. It improved physician satisfaction. It obviously led to patient satisfaction, because suddenly, as a physician, I'm looking into the eyes of my patient rather than looking at the computer. It's saving time, and now on the financial side, it generates additional physician capacity without additional headcount, because you're able to do work faster. And rather than have to hire doctors, you now have clinician time available. And there was actually financial impact that we were actually able to demonstrate. We're still polishing off the finalities of the case study. That number is definitely more than 10 times for every rupee invested. It's hovering in the late teens, but we'll come back to that one.
I just wanted to add one point. One of the things that I personally experienced was that when a clinician enters a narrative, it's more conversational and hence more robust, medico-legally also. That's the conversation he's had. And that's something that I found specifically as an advantage in these kind of softwares like yours, which I felt was very useful. My narratives were very nicely documented. Whereas when I write it on an EMR, I put it in bullet points. I don't put narratives. Whereas when I go into details of the narratives, it's captured, and when I review it again, it's a much nicer notes that I review, and I remember those conversations better.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think in the oncology use case, a 30-minute consult, pre-Augnito, I mean, we do a lot of work, in the cancer space. Pre-Augnito, on an average, you're spending about 15 to 17 minutes with the patient, and around 10 to 30 minutes actually capturing all those bullets, etc. that you mentioned. Post-Augnito, you're actually spending up to 25 to 27 minutes with the patient, and you're finishing off your document with those narratives in less than 3 to 4 minutes. So it just helps, give so much more time back to the patient. But I think I do want to be conscious of the time. I know you have to head to dinner with the UN. But thank you all so much. I hope this was, informative, fruitful, thought-provoking for all of us here. On your desks, you'll see some reflection cards. There's single-page A5 sheets with Augnito logos. I'd love for you to spend maybe a minute or so, just jot down, your top 1, top 3, takeaways from here. In our work as an IT professional, as a clinician, as an operational leader, as a business leader, what would you want to take back to your workplace? I think I'd love to, maybe just leave that as a thought and a reflection for you. But I think, thank you all so much. It's been our pleasure. Just a big round of applause for the